Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt. Thank you for listening to the program this morning. Joined now by United States Senator John Thune from the great state of South Dakota. He is the GOP whip number 2 in the House, in the Senate Republican caucus. Good morning, Senator Thune. How's everyone on the Thune family side? Everyone healthy?
We are indeed. Thank you, Hugh, and hopefully yours as well.
Yeah, indeed. And I begin by asking you about the pandemic. The statistics that I'm looking at show that of all the tens of thousands of deaths in America, only 1,500. I know that's a large number, but only 1,500 of the tens of thousands have been for people 45 and younger. Does our reopening plan have to start taking account of this demographic reality, Senator?
I think it does. I think that's it needs to be a factor, and I think the phased approach that the White House has proposed and that many states are implementing and adopting will include those types of considerations. I think that vulnerable people with pre-existing conditions, elderly, nursing homes, people in that age category just have to be more careful. And I think that as the opening occurs and it starts to ramp up, I think that's something that needs to be a part and factor because, as you point out, that's where the greatest risk is.
Now, yesterday or 2 days ago, Speaker Pelosi put out a silly, absurd bill. I call it cash for cannabis because there's a provision in there that takes care of marijuana dispensaries. It's just not a serious bill. When are we going to get to what Fed Chairman Powell said is a very necessary phase 4, Senator Thune?
Well, I think we will soon enough, Hugh. And this is really true. Even the media has described the House approach as just a grab bag of Democratic priorities, a messaging bill destined to go nowhere in the Senate. That even meeting resistance from some Democrats. That's the way it's been characterized by the press. But clearly, nobody is taking it seriously, and it does include a whole bunch of just sort of over-the-top features like the fact that it mentions cannabis more times than it mentions jobs. And there's a provision in there, a Democrat priority, repeal the SALT cap, which is a huge tax cut for millionaires, and actually 56% of that benefit goes to the top 1% of people in this country in terms of income. So there's just a lot of really crazy stuff in there. If it's not a Democrat wish list, I don't know what is. What we're working on here in the Senate, obviously, are trying to respond to the real health emergency and economic crisis needs of the American people, and determining, based on what we've done so far, what those needs are. And we will react and respond in a timely way, hopefully in a bipartisan way, to address the ongoing economic hardship that's being felt by businesses across this country, workers across this country, families across this country, but not go down this crazy path chosen by the House Democrats, which, again, is just nothing more, nothing less, and nothing else than a messaging exercise.
The old saying is true. The hedgehog knows one thing, the fox knows many things. Well, dumb foxes are in the middle of the road, and I think that's what the House bill is. It's in the middle of the road. But the hedgehog is the Republican caucus. And the one thing, Larry Kudlow on this show earlier this week, Leader McConnell, I expect you will say the same thing, that is the must-have is liability protection for all Americans from any allegation that they are responsible for the virus. And without that, the country will not recover. It's got to be a blanket, I think almost a non-suit provision for anyone who wants to claim a tort injury in state or federal law against anybody for the virus. I'm not even inclined now to allow reckless disregard claims because they will bankrupt people.
Well, we do need a federal shield, and that is a priority for us. These lawsuits represent a very real and present threat to any kind of economic recovery. And Senate Republicans are going to stand firm and pursue liability protections for healthcare workers, businesses, others on the front line of the response and the reopening phase. And the Democrats, Hugh, of course, always paint this as this is just protecting big corporations. Not true. I mean, this is doctors, this is hospitals, people making extraordinary efforts to protect patients and healthcare workers, but are living in fear of being sued if a patient were somehow exposed to the disease in the process of receiving care. So you've got nonprofits, you've got hospitals, you've got businesses. You go right down the list. Schools. There's just we can't be going down this path of frivolous lawsuits, driving up the cost of reopening our economy, and potentially prolonging a recession or driving us worse into a depression. We're in the middle of a pandemic. What we don't need is an epidemic of frivolous lawsuits to make it that much harder for us to recover.
There are two sectors that I repeatedly return to, Senator Thune. One is higher education, colleges and universities are on the brink because they're a tuition-dependent, semi-annual infusion of cash that if they don't get it, they collapse. And the second are restaurants. Both of those sectors absolutely need liability protection. I mean, absolute shield. They need the Avengers to surround them. Otherwise, their margins aren't there. And if so, a student becomes sick on campus and sues the private campus or the state university under some exception to sovereign immunity, they're done for. And the restaurant, which is barely going to reopen anyway with margins that are probably set back 5 years, they can't afford even the threat of it. They can't afford to respond to the lawyer's letter.
Right. I mean, and the idea of having to hire lawyers to respond, and just the enormous of just dealing with everything that comes with a lawsuit like that, plus not to mention, in many cases, probably, these people are not going to be accustomed to this. This adds to anxiety in businesses where the margins are very thin. I mean, restaurants operate on thin margins. They're going to continue to have their restaurants for some time well into the future, probably half full. Hopefully phasing up to better than that. But in the meantime, they're going to be scraping to get by, and they one thing they can't deal with. And colleges are a good example as well. I mean, our state in South Dakota, I've talked to all our college presidents. They're expecting a significant reduction next fall in enrollment, a significant increase in costs associated with having to hire more faculty for smaller classroom sizes. All those sorts of things are going to make it really, really tough for folks operating with thin margins to get by. This would complicate and exacerbate and make it that much harder for them to survive.
Now, Senator, I want to veer off into a couple of conversations with you and then come back to the phase 4. But I have to ask you about Judge Sullivan's just outrageous decision to invite briefing on someone's when the prosecution wants to dismiss a case. He's leaving it open. He's appointed a retired judge to come in. It's extraordinary. It is an assault on civil liberties, the likes of which I haven't seen in a federal court in my 33 years of practice. Can the Senate Judiciary Committee hold an emergency hearing on this? Because it is outrageous.
It is. It is a gross miscarriage of justice. And I'm hoping, and I haven't talked to Senator Graham, who, as you know, chairs the Judiciary Committee, but it certainly seems to be the substance of a hearing to get at what this judge has done. And if you are, you cannot now say that the previous administration wasn't doing everything they possibly could to screw it up for an incoming administration to the point of taking actions that arguably are illegal. And I think, frankly, this needs to be fully investigated and figure out how high up it goes in the administration. We're seeing some of that evidence coming out now. I think there'll be more that will come out. But this was a full-scale, appears to be conspiracy to undermine and try and take down an incoming administration, a new president.
And one side of it is Judge Sullivan, the other is the unmasking. And a reporter asked the president in the Rose Garden the other day, what is Obamagate? And he said everybody knows, and he walked away. I describe it this way. It is the intentional interference with the peaceful, seamless, cooperative transition of power, which is the glory of the American Republic. And that clearly went on between the time of the surprise win of Donald Trump and his swearing in, and these 39 requests for unmasking are unprecedented. Now, we get a lot of dirt being kicked up. Unmaskings happen all the time. I'll bet you there were very few unmaskings of senior incoming Obama officials in between the election of President Obama-elect and his inauguration by George W. Bush administration official, Senator Thune. I'm not afraid of that data set comparison at all.
I'm not either, and I can't imagine that the Bush administration would go to these lengths, even though they disagreed profoundly with, at that time, incoming President Obama and his agenda. But we've always allowed for, and I think as you described it, and the Wall Street Journal, an editorial page described it, peaceful transition of power is the hallmark of American democracy. And and clearly this was an attempt to try and undermine and cripple the Trump administration as they came on the scene. And that's why it is unprecedented. I don't think, certainly we've heard the end of it. This needs to be something that is carefully reviewed and investigated, and let's find out how far up it goes.
So there's a lot of poison in the system, so I come back to phase 4. I even admit that the states need, for example, some backstop on unemployment claim money that they just don't have. And that's related to the collapse of sales tax revenue, the late payment on property taxes, people fleeing the states, not staying at hotels. They have legitimate needs unrelated to their pension fiascos, et cetera. With all the poison in the system, is there anyone for you and Senator McConnell to sit down with to actually negotiate 3.75, the emergency stuff, the liability shield, and some state aid? Is there anybody over there that you can work with?
Well, I hate to tell you, Hugh, because you know you want everybody to hope and think the best, and anything that passes the Senate obviously has to be, of course, as you know, bipartisan. But it's really hard to get reasonable people to sit down because they're so held hostage to the House agenda. I mean, Schumer is looking over his shoulder at Pelosi. Pelosi's looking over her shoulder at AOC, and the Sanders folks, and they're just being pulled so hard to the left that it's hard to find anything, any Democrat now that you could characterize as moderate or reasonable to negotiate with. So my guess is what happens, at least I hope what happens, is that the White House works with Senate Republicans to put together an agenda that makes sense, that addresses the economic and health emergency needs of the American people, and that we can bring Democrats in to negotiate and to find some common ground. But it gets really hard when you go to that House because right now they're all running for re-election, and the base of their party, the activists, the donors, everybody is part of that socialist wing of the Democratic Party, and it's going to make it very, very hard for us, I think, to get some of these things done. But we're going to do everything we can because we're here to respond to what the American people need, and we're focused. We want to do it in a bipartisan way. We hope there are Democrats who are willing and Democrats who can be reasonable about what needs to be done and get away from this sort of left-wing agenda that is right now captivated all the House Democrats.
Last question, Senator. In California's 25th, which had been won by the Democrats by 7 points, Mike Garcia crushed it. The Republican won by a dozen points, maybe more. Doesn't that send a message to the Democrats that they're a illusory blue wave? They took the mask off, and America does not want left-wing AOC policies?
You would think so. I hope that's the way it's received by the Democrats. That is a very historic election out there. Of course, we had a strong candidate, but you think about flipping a blue seat for the first time in over 20 years. It definitely, I think, should sound an alarm. They should be hearing something on the Democrat side about the fact that the American people, even in a state like California, want policies that don't represent a far left agenda that moves us closer and closer to a Western European style socialist type democracy.
Agreed. Senator Thune, always a pleasure. Thank you for joining me, Senator. Really enjoy it, and I appreciate the time.